profound shift awaits those who dare to cross the ancient threshold between worlds. A journey beyond everything you thought you knew about reality itself. What secrets did the mystery schools guard so carefully? And how did they forever transform those who entered their sacred chambers? Imagine standing at the threshold between two worlds, the familiar reality you've always known, and a realm of mystery that will forever change you. In the flickering torchlight of subterranean chambers beneath the temple of Eleusis, initiates trembled as they prepared to cross such a threshold. In the vast stone halls of Egyptian pyramids, candidates for initiation fasted for days, their minds hovering between ordinary awareness and something beyond. What if I told you that these ancient initiatory rituals weren't primitive superstition, but sophisticated technologies of consciousness transformation? What if the secret knowledge guarded by mystery schools for millennia wasn't information at all, but rather a specific state of being, a profound shift in perception that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to understand? The ancients knew that we've forgotten that consciousness itself is malleable, and that certain thresholds, once crossed, change us forever. Today we journey into the psychology of initiation, the science of crossing between worlds. Welcome, fellow traveler, to a journey beyond the veil of ordinary perception. I invite you not merely as a viewer, but as a potential initiate, one who recognizes that deep within you lies the same yearning for transcendence that drove seekers to the mystery schools of old. Whether you know it consciously or not, you have already crossed many thresholds in your life. Moments where you stood suspended between who you were and who you were becoming. The ancients recognized these transitional states as sacred gateways, opportunities, not just for change, but for complete transformation of consciousness. Today, we will explore these forgotten technologies of the soul together, not as distant academic curiosities, but as living wisdom that still pulses at the heart of human experience. For the true initiatory path is not locked in dusty scrolls or buried temples. It awaits rediscovery within your own awareness, within the liminal spaces of your existence. The mysteries have never truly been hidden from those with eyes to see. They speak in the language of symbols that transcend time, in psychological patterns etched into the fabric of meaningful human experience. And today, neuroscience is finally catching up to what the hierophants and mystagogues of old always knew about the transformative potential of the human mind. Join me as we decode the sacred science of crossing between worlds. Our exploration will take us through the veiled corridors of history's most profound mystery traditions, from the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece that persisted for nearly 2,000 years, to the initiatory chambers of Egypt, where candidates faced elaborate trials of body and spirit. We'll uncover the carefully designed psychological mechanisms that made these initiations so powerfully transformative. The use of sensory deprivation and overstimulation, symbolic death and rebirth, and the deliberate creation of what psychologists now call liminal space, the fertile void between established identities where new possibilities emerge. Modern neuroscience offers unprecedented insights into what happens in the brain during transcendent experiences. We'll explore fascinating research on how altered states like those induced in ancient initiations can temporarily disrupt the brain's default mode network, dissolving the boundaries of the self and opening consciousness to mystical experiences of unity and interconnection. Yet this journey isn't merely academic. The wisdom of the mystery schools offers profound guidance for navigating the initiatory thresholds in our own lives. Those moments of transition, challenge, and transformation that shape our becoming. By understanding their psychological mechanics, we can consciously engage with these threshold experiences as opportunities for genuine initiation into greater awareness. The ancient mysteries have always been hiding in plain sight, waiting for those ready to perceive them. Let us now part the veil and step into their sacred wisdom. By mystery, we mean a series of cults, religious practices, and rites developed and spread in antiquity throughout the Greek and Mediterranean world, as scholars have noted, characterized by an initiatory path, which gave gradual access to knowledge and to a following personal advancement. These were not casual spiritual practices, but profound systems designed to systematically transform consciousness through stages of revelation. The word mystery itself comes from the Greek mysteria, combining maio, meaning to close, as in closing one's mouth in secrecy or closing one's eyes to go within, and tyria, meaning festival. This etymology reveals the dual nature of the mysteries. They were both deeply internal experiences and communal celebrations, uniting personal transformation with collective ritual. Among the most renowned were the Eleusinian mysteries, dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, which flourished for nearly 2 millennia from approximately 1450 BCE to 392 CE. These mysteries centered on the myth of Persephone's abduction to the underworld and Demeter's quest to recover her daughter, a powerful metaphor for the soul's journey through darkness and return to light. The initiatory process was carefully structured. The mysteries began with the March of the Mystai, initiates, in solemn procession from Athens to Eleusis, historical accounts tell us. Before this journey, candidates underwent purification rites at the lesser mysteries, followed months later by more profound ceremonies at the greater mysteries. This staged approach was deliberate. The psyche needed preparation before it could withstand the full revelation. In ancient Egypt, the initiatory tradition was equally sophisticated. Candidates underwent long periods of study, fasting, and ritual before being admitted to the inner teachings. One had to understand the motions of celestial objects and be attuned with their energies if they were to become a high priest or priestess. Egyptian initiations were cosmic in scope, aligning human consciousness with celestial cycles and divine principles. What distinguishes mystery traditions across cultures was their requirement for secrecy. Initiates were bound by solemn oaths never to reveal what they had experienced within the sacred chambers. The main characteristic of these religious schools was the secrecy associated with the particulars of the initiation and the ritual practice, which may not be revealed to outsiders. This veil of secrecy serves multiple purposes. It protected sacred knowledge from misuse and ensured that each initiate would have a direct, unmediated experience rather than a preconceived notion of what to expect. This secrecy has made it challenging for modern scholars to fully reconstruct these ancient practices. Yet, enough evidence remains in fragments of texts, archaeological findings, and writings of ancient philosophers to recognize their sophisticated psychological methodology. The mystery schools were not practicing primitive superstition. They were operating with a profound understanding of human consciousness and its capacity for transformation. In ancient, pre-axial age cultures, from ancient Egypt to the British Isles, to Vedic India and the Himalayas, to South America, Chaldea, Sumeria, ancient Greece, Babylon, and others, there were esoteric traditions of initiation that guided men and women to awaken as souls, then to awaken as the One, and then to embody that on earth. This description reveals that behind their diversity, mystery traditions shared a common understanding of human potential and the stages of its unfolding. The first key to understanding initiation psychology lies in what happens in the brain during transformative experiences. Recent neuroscientific research offers remarkable insights into the neural correlates of the mystical states that ancient initiations sought to induce. Studies examining brain activity during profound altered states have identified the default mode network, DMN, as crucial to understanding transformative experiences. The DMN is a network of interconnected brain regions that becomes active when we're not focused on the external world, when our minds are wandering, reflecting on ourselves, or thinking about the past or future. It's considered by many neuroscientists to be subterranean, the source of the ego, the notion of self, and an identification with the thoughts, emotions, and roles one plays in the world. What's fascinating is that during mystical experiences, whether induced through meditation, psychedelics, which were likely used in some ancient mystery traditions, or other means, researchers observe a reduction in neural activity in the major centers of the brain, including the default mode network. This temporary dampening of the DMN appears to correlate with experiences of ego dissolution, the sense that the boundary between self and world is dissolving. This neurological insight helps explain why mystery schools designed initiations that deliberately disrupted ordinary consciousness through combinations of fasting, sensory manipulation, symbolic dramas, and in some cases, ingestion of psychoactive substances. They created conditions that would temporarily quiet the brain's default mode of operation, allowing initiates to experience reality beyond the constraints of their ordinary identity. A fascinating parallel comes from recent research on general anesthesia, where scientists discovered that anesthesia shifts the functional connectivity of the human brain away from its usual patterns. While anesthesia itself wasn't used in ancient initiations, this research demonstrates how profoundly our experience of reality depends on specific brain states that can be deliberately altered. Even more intriguing, this research reveals that under anesthesia, the human brain becomes less distinguishable from each other, but also less distinguishable from the brains of other primates. This suggests that our uniquely human consciousness, our sense of individual identity separated from others and from nature, requires active maintenance by specific neural patterns. When these patterns are temporarily disrupted, as they were in mystery school initiations, boundaries dissolve and a more fundamental, unified consciousness emerges. The mystery schools understood empirically what science now confirms, that consciousness is malleable, and that under certain conditions, the boundaries of the self can be temporarily dissolved, allowing for experiences of unity, transcendence, and connection with something greater than the individual ego. The second key to understanding initiation psychology lies in the concept of liminality, the threshold state between established identities or realities. Anthropologists and psychologists have recognized this as a universal element in transformative rituals across cultures. Liminality derives from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold. It describes physical, physiological, and psychological transition zones, the area between your starting point and your destination. In initiatory contexts, liminality is deliberately induced to create the psychological conditions necessary for transformation. Victor Turner, a pioneering researcher in this field, described liminality as an anti-structural state that exists outside normal social boundaries and categories. During liminal periods, individuals exist in a state of ambiguity, having left behind their previous identity but not yet integrated a new one. This state can be disorienting and even frightening. But it's precisely this dissolution of familiar structures that creates the possibility for profound change. According to Turner, all liminality must eventually dissolve, for it is a state of great intensity that cannot exist very long without some sort of structure to stabilize it. This temporary nature of liminality explains why mystery initiations were carefully structured experiences with clear beginnings and endings. They created containers for transformative intensity that would have been unsustainable in everyday life. The mystery schools expertly engineered liminal experiences. Consider the Eleusinian mysteries, where initiates participated in a ritual procession from Athens to Eleusis, symbolically leaving behind their ordinary world. They then underwent fasting and other preparatory rites before entering the telesterion, or Hall of Initiation, where the secret ceremonies took place. This progression deliberately moved participants through increasingly liminal states, culminating in whatever revelatory experience awaited in the inner sanctum. What happens psychologically during such liminal experiences? Research suggests that when we're removed from familiar contexts and certainties, our minds become more receptive to new patterns of thinking and being. The protective structures of our ordinary identity temporarily loosen, allowing for what Turner called spontaneous communitas, a direct, immediate experience of human connection beyond social roles and hierarchies. This explains why many mystery traditions incorporated elements that would be disorienting or challenging, from fasting and sleep deprivation to confusing symbolic narratives and surprising sensory experiences. By disrupting ordinary mental patterns, they created a psychological opening through which new awareness could enter. The mystery schools understood that transformation occurs not through comfortable, predictable experiences, but through encounters with the unknown that challenge our existing frameworks. As one contemporary practitioner of ritual notes, Beneton, initiation is that shift of consciousness that takes us beyond our comfortable, known world. We have crossed the boundary line, and we have changed along with our view of the world. How might we apply this ancient wisdom about initiation and liminality in our modern lives? While we can't exactly recreate the Eleusinian mysteries in our living rooms, we can recognize and consciously engage with the natural thresholds that appear throughout our lives. Every significant transition, career changes, relationships beginning or ending, relocations, losses, even internal shifts in belief or identity, creates a natural liminal space. Rather than rushing through these transitions or numbing the discomfort they bring, we might approach them as the ancients approached their mysteries, as sacred opportunities for transformation. Research on modern rite of passage experiences suggests that acknowledging transitions through ritualized forms can have significant psychological benefits. However, as one study on college initiation ceremonies found, not all modern attempts at initiation are equally effective or ethical. The difference lies in intention and design. Whether the experience is created to foster genuine transformation or merely to establish hierarchical power. An ethical modern approach to initiation honors the wisdom of ancient traditions while adapting their insights to contemporary understanding. The key elements to preserve include, first, preparation. The mystery schools never thrust unprepared initiates into their most profound experiences. Modern initiations similarly benefit from conscious preparation, whether through study, reflection, or preliminary practices that ready the mind and heart for transformation. Second, liminality creates a clear demarcation between ordinary life and the initiatory space. This might be achieved through retreat, fasting, meditation, or simply through creating dedicated time and space set apart from daily routines. Third, community and witness. While many modern spiritual seekers emphasize individual practice, the mystery traditions understood the importance of initiation taking place within a held container of community. Having witnesses to our transitions, whether mentors, friends, or fellow initiates, helps integrate and validate the experience. Finally, integration of the mysteries didn't end with the revelatory experience, but included guidance for incorporating that experience into daily life. Similarly, modern initiatory work requires time for reflection, meaning-making, and gradual incorporation of insights into ordinary awareness. One contemporary approach draws on the power of ritual postures, specific body positions that may have been used in ancient initiatory contexts to facilitate altered states of consciousness. Researchers have found that a physiological shift accompanies and supports the shift of consciousness and can be the trigger to achieve altered states of consciousness. This suggests that even simple physical practices, when approached with intention, can create initiatory experiences. The psychological research on initiation offers another important insight that the intensity of the initiatory experience correlates with the strength of connection felt afterward. Studies show that individuals who undergo an unpleasant initiation to become members of a group increase their liking for the group. This helps explain why difficult transitions, when consciously navigated as initiations, can lead to profound gifts of increased meaning and connection. By recognizing the initiatory potential in life's transitions, we can transform what might otherwise be merely disorienting experiences into opportunities for genuine evolution of consciousness. When we step back and examine the phenomenon of initiation across cultures and throughout history, a transcendent pattern emerges, one that connects individual transformation to collective evolution and cosmic principles. The mystery schools didn't see initiation as merely a personal psychological process, but as participation in a universal pattern of death and rebirth, darkness and illumination, fragmentation and wholeness. The Eleusinian mysteries centered on Persephone's descent to the underworld and return to the surface. The Egyptian mysteries worked with Osiris's death and resurrection. And other traditions had their own symbolic narratives of this fundamental cycle. These weren't merely cultural stories. They reflected a profound understanding of consciousness itself. As researcher Marjorie Woolacott observes in her studies of mystical experiences, despite their different etiologies, three types of spiritually transformative experiences, near-death experiences, psilocybin experiences, and meditative experiences of cosmic consciousness appear to have attributes that are common to a broad range of mystical experiences, including an experience of expanded awareness. This suggests that the transformative states cultivated in mystery traditions access something fundamental about human consciousness, patterns of awareness that transcend cultural and historical contexts. The experiences of ancient initiates and those of modern experimental subjects in neuroscience laboratories may be accessing the same underlying capacities of the human mind. Moreover, research shows that these experiences can have lasting transformative effects. Studies indicate that all three types of spiritual experiences appear to be associated with profound and lasting transformations in the lives of experiencers. The ancient mystery schools knew that they weren't creating temporary altered states for entertainment, but deliberately invoking experiences that would permanently shift the initiate's relationship with reality. This transformative potential connects individual initiation to collective human evolution. The mystery schools served as centers not just for personal growth, but for cultural advancement, with many initiated individuals going on to become philosophical, artistic, and political leaders in their societies. The mysteries played a central role in ancient cultures as pathways of self-development, transformation, and awakening, through which many of those who would go on to play significant roles in society would pass. From this transcendent perspective, we can see initiation not merely as a personal psychological process, but as participation in the evolution of human consciousness itself. Each individual who undergoes authentic initiation, whether through traditional means or through conscious engagement with life's natural thresholds, contributes to the expansion of what's possible for human awareness. As our journey through the psychology of ancient initiations draws to a close, we stand together at yet another threshold. The boundary between intellectual understanding and lived experience, between knowing about the mysteries and entering into them. The ancient initiates knew that true wisdom could never be fully conveyed through words alone. It must be experienced, embodied, lived. The mysteries have always been waiting, hidden in plain sight within the fabric of your own consciousness. They speak in the language of symbols that resonate in the deepest chambers of your psyche. They whisper in moments of synchronicity, in dreams that linger upon waking, in fleeting experiences of connection that transcend ordinary understanding. Every threshold you face contains initiatory potential. Every challenge, transition, loss, or awakening offers a doorway between worlds. Will you pass through unconsciously, clinging to the familiar shore of what you've known? Or will you step forward with the courage of the ancient initiates, willing to be transformed by what awaits beyond the veil? The true mystery schools never died. They simply changed form. Today they exist wherever consciousness meets its own depths, wherever the egoic self encounters its limitations and discovers something greater. They exist in moments of creative inspiration, in profound meditation, in the silent space between heartbeats, in the recognition of your own face, in the eyes of a stranger. The hierophants and mystagogues of old understood that initiation is not something done to you, but something you participate in with your whole being. They created elaborate ceremonies and tests, not to withhold knowledge, but to ensure that when revelation came, you would be ready to receive it, to be transformed by it, rather than destroyed. That same invitation echoes across the centuries to where you sit right now. The thresholds await your conscious crossing. The mysteries remain alive, breathing just beneath the surface of ordinary perception. The ancient wisdom of initiation continues to unfold within the temple of your own awareness. Will you accept the invitation? Will you step through the doorway between worlds? The choice, as it has always been, remains yours to make.